Hello all, welcome back to my channel. Thanks so much for tuning in. I've got the picks for week 10 of the 2022 college football season ready to go. Before we get to that though, let's review what happened last week in week 9. There were 18 picks on the day. I went 14-4 in said picks, which brings my overall record for the season to 108 correct picks versus 22 incorrect picks. That's an 83% clip, folks. That's pretty dang good. I was 2-1 in the top 25 matchups, which brings my season total to 19-6 in those matchups. And there were no top 10 matchups last week, meaning I remain 4-0 in top 10 matchups. This week, we've got 4 games between teams ranked in the top 25, 2 of which are between teams ranked in the top 10. So it is a big, consequential week in college football this week, including one matchup, which is the biggest one of the season so far. So without further ado, let's go ahead and jump into the picks, shall we? We are using the College Football Playoff Committee rankings this week. They released their first set of rankings this past Tuesday. So for the rest of the season, we will be using those rankings rather than the AP rankings, because the College Football Playoff Committee rankings are the ones that will determine who the 4 participants are in the playoff at the end of the season. Speaking of those rankings, the number 1 team in those CFP rankings, the Tennessee Volunteers at 8-0. They are on the road in the biggest matchup of the season so far against number 3, Georgia. If we look at the stats here, there's one thing that stands out that's causing me to lean one way versus the other in this one, and that's pass defense. Tennessee has a pass defense that is not very good. They are allowing 300 yards a game through the air. Georgia, meanwhile, is holding opponents to 177 yards through the air. Both teams are allowing less than 100 yards rushing to their opponents. Tennessee is a little bit better at throwing the ball than Georgia is, although Georgia is averaging 328 through the air as opposed to Tennessee's 353. So it's not like Georgia is a slacker when it comes to throwing the ball. They're also very good at passing offense. That pass defense for Tennessee worries me. They let up 455 passing yards in that win a couple of weeks ago against Alabama. Also, this game is at Georgia. In the game against Alabama a couple of weeks ago, Tennessee had the home field advantage, which I think helped propel them to the 18-point lead they built up in the first half of that game. Remember, though, Alabama came back and took the lead in the second half, and then Tennessee had to come back and then win the game by a field goal at the end. I do not think that Tennessee is going to accumulate an 18-point lead on Georgia this time. The home field advantage is with Georgia. I don't think Tennessee would have won that game against Alabama had they not had an 18-point lead at one stage of the game. I think Tennessee's pass defense is going to prove their downfall in this game. I'm going to go with the Georgia Bulldogs to pull the upset and win the game against Tennessee, because I think their passing attack is going to score points against a weak Tennessee passing defense, and I think Georgia's defense is going to let up some points, because nobody's going to totally stop Tennessee, but they'll stop them enough that it'll get them the win. According to ESPN's analytics, whoever wins this game has a 99% chance to win the SEC East and go on to the SEC Championship game. So this has consequences for SEC Championship contention. It also has playoff contention. I'm not sure how much a loss in this game really hurts either of the teams involved. Whoever wins this game is likely going to go to the SEC Championship game, and they might be undefeated. Let's imagine that they will be. The loser won't even go to the SEC Championship game, but if Tennessee loses this game, they've lost to the number 3 team in the nation. How far in the polls are they really going to drop? If Georgia loses this game, they lost to the number 1 team in the nation. How far in the polls are they really going to drop? There is a chance that whoever loses this game could still be ranked high enough in the polls to have a shot at the playoff later on this season. I'm not saying I think that they're going to have 3 SEC teams in the playoff. I'm just saying I think there's a chance for that to happen. But for this week's matchup, I am going to go with the Georgia Bulldogs to get the win over Tennessee. Number 2, the Ohio State Buckeyes. They are 8-0. They are on the road against Northwestern, who is having another very bad, very down season. They are not very good this year. Ohio State is very good this year. Go with Ohio State to move to 9-0 and do their part to march to the inevitable matchup between an undefeated Ohio State and an undefeated Michigan at the end of the season. Number 3, Georgia. I have just said a second ago that I think they are going to beat Tennessee at home, and they'll probably reclaim the number 1 spot in next week's CFP rankings. Number 4, the Clemson Tigers, in a position that most people, including myself, don't think they should be in at number 4. That's a pretty high ranking for them. They're 8-0 on the season. They're on the road at Notre Dame. I believe that I know the reason why Clemson is ranked number 4. They have wins against a ranked NC State team, a ranked Wake Forest team, and a ranked Syracuse team. And I think that gave them the edge in the playoff committee's mind over Michigan, who only has 1 win in the top 25, and that was the win against Penn State at home a couple of weeks ago. I, though, along with many others, don't think Clemson is actually that good. In the win they had 2 weeks ago against Syracuse, their come-from-behind win, they pulled their starting quarterback, DJU, and had to go with their backup, I think his name's Corey Klubnik, in order to win that game, and relied a lot on their running game with Will Shipley to get them that come-from-behind win. They've had a bye week to get their offense right, to get themselves healthy, to figure out what's going on with DJU, what's going on with the offense, why are they not producing in the way that Clemson expects them to perform and to play. Notre Dame's won 5 out of their last 6 games, including a win against North Carolina, who's ranked, and a win against Syracuse, who's ranked. I think the bye week is pretty important here, though. I trust head coach Dabo Swinney to fix whatever is ailing Clemson's offense. Clemson's defense, meanwhile, is still very good. It's still top flight. I think it's going to slow down the Notre Dame offense, and the Clemson offense will do just enough to get the win in this one. I don't think it's going to be a big margin of victory. I think it's going to be a close game, but I think Clemson is going to get the job done after a bye week of rest and additional planning. So go with Clemson in that one. Number 5, Michigan. They are 8-0. They are a spot behind Clemson for reasons that I just mentioned. They are on the road against Rutgers. Rutgers is a little bit better this year than they've been in past years under head coach Greg Schiano, but they're still not good. And I still don't think they're anywhere near Michigan's league, so look for Michigan to go to 9-0 and win this one pretty easily and do their part to march towards the inevitable undefeated matchup between them and Ohio State at the end of the year. It's what we're doing in the Big Ten. Yeah, Illinois is having a great season, and it's a nice story, but everyone's waiting for Michigan, Ohio State. That's what the whole Big Ten has been doing this whole season. In the second of the top 10 matchups this week, we've got number 6 Alabama at 7-1. They are on the road at LSU, who is 6-2 on the season. I think LSU is ranked a little bit too high. They did get that big win at home against Ole Miss last week, but I think ranking them in the top 10 is a little much. If we look at the stats, Alabama is better at running the ball than is LSU. Alabama is a lot better at stopping the run than is LSU. Alabama is a little bit better at passing than is LSU, and they're both about the same when it comes to passing defense. They're both about the same when it comes to third down completion percentage. LSU has some more turnovers that they've gained than has Alabama. I think, though, it's instructive to look at how each team fared against Tennessee, because that's a common opponent that they've both played. Alabama is on the road at Ole Miss next week, so we'll see what they do against an opponent that LSU managed to beat. But both of these teams lost to Tennessee, so let's look at how they performed. In Alabama's performance against Tennessee, they let up 385 passing yards and 5 touchdowns to Hendon Hooker. That was not a real great performance for Alabama's passing defense. LSU, meanwhile, only let up 239 yards passing to Tennessee, but they let up 264 yards rushing to Tennessee, which was much more than what Alabama let up. Alabama's defense kept Tennessee's running game in check. It's that high-powered passing game that they could not stop. LSU couldn't stop either. They couldn't stop them passing. They couldn't stop them rushing. Also, LSU only gained 55 yards rushing themselves against the Volunteers. I think this game against Alabama is going to play out very similarly. Alabama also has a high-powered passing attack. Alabama also has a good running game. Alabama also holds their opponents to less than 100 yards rushing per game. I think Alabama's defense is going to slow down LSU's running game. I think Alabama is going to make LSU's offense one-dimensional and make quarterback Jaden Daniels have to take all the weight on his shoulders to pass the ball well and to perform. I think that one-dimensionality is going to cause or allow Alabama's defense to start teeing off on Jaden Daniels, who's been sacked a bunch of times this year. And I think Alabama's passing game is going to eventually take over as LSU's defense just gets tired from having to face yet another high-powered offense and have to stop them. They faced a high-powered offense last week in Ole Miss and stopped them pretty effectively. I don't think they're going to do that this week. I'm going to go with Alabama to get this win. Also, Alabama going to 8-1. Them, Ole Miss, and LSU are all kind of in the mix for the SEC West. But Alabama's not just thinking about conference championships. They're thinking about national championships. They're thinking about playoff performances. They cannot lose another game and expect to get into the playoff this year. If they lose this game at LSU or they lose next week at Ole Miss, they are not going to get into the playoff. If they want a shot, they have to win this game, they have to win the next game, and they have to win the conference. Because even if Alabama gets the championship game, say in a rematch against Tennessee, or since I've called Tennessee to lose against Georgia, they can't lose that game and still expect that they're going to get into the playoff. Not with how good Ohio State and Michigan are playing, not with how good TCU is playing in the Big 12, not with how good Oregon and UCLA and USC are all playing in the Pac-12, not with Clemson being undefeated in the ACC and getting the benefit of the doubt from the playoff committee. It's just not going to happen. I think they will be not in full desperation mode, but kind of getting into desperation mode to make sure they keep their playoff hopes alive. So go with Alabama in this matchup. Number 7, TCU, the Horned Frogs. They're at 8-0 and probably disrespected a little bit by the CFP committee. They are home versus Texas Tech. Texas Tech is not going to be a cakewalk for them. Texas Tech is a nice team that put up fights against a couple of teams like Texas and Oklahoma State earlier this year. I do think TCU's got the goods to win because I do believe in TCU. I'm a convert now to believing in this version of the Horned Frogs. Look to TCU to go to 9-0 and keep their lead in the Big 12. Number 8, the Oregon Ducks at 7-1. They are on the road against Colorado. Colorado is not very good this year. Oregon is very good this year. I think even if Bo Nix ended up having a bad game, even if the bad Bo Nix showed up in this one, I think Oregon still has the goods in the running game and their defense is good enough that they can stop Colorado. So I think if you're an Oregon fan, you're kind of hoping that bad Bo Nix shows up here because he can do that and your team can still get the win. I'm going to go with Oregon to go to 8-1 and keep their control over the Pac-12 North. Number 9, USC. They're also 7-1. They are home against Cal. Cal is not very good, especially offensively. USC is very good, especially offensively. Look for USC to go to 8-1 on the season. I'm going with USC in that game. Number 10, LSU. I've already said I think they are going to lose at home to Alabama. Number 11, Ole Miss. They are 8-1 on the year. They've got a bye week this week before they host Alabama in another big SEC matchup next week. So no pick for Ole Miss. Another Pac-12 team comes in at number 12. That's the UCLA Bruins. They're 7-1 on the year. They are at Arizona State. Arizona is the better of the two, or Arizona State, is the better of the two Arizona schools. but they're not UCLA good. UCLA's offense, I think, will continue to shine with quarterback Dorian Thompson-Robinson playing well, although in their game last week, he did get roughed up a little bit, so watch out for that in this particular matchup. But I think UCLA's got what they need to beat Arizona State on the road. Go with UCLA to keep pace with USC at 8-1. Number 13, Kansas State, coming off their absolute, complete destruction of Oklahoma State at home last week to the tune of 48-0 in a pick that I completely missed. I got that one so wrong, it's embarrassing how wrong I got that pick. That Kansas State team, they are home once again, hosting the number 24 team in the nation, the Texas Longhorns. If we look at the stats, Kansas State is better at rushing the ball than Texas is. Texas is much better at passing the ball than Kansas State is. And they're both roughly the same in terms of their pass and run defense, with Kansas State being a little bit better at pass defense, Texas being a little bit better at run defense. Kansas State's secondary turns the ball over quite a bit more, though. They have 11 interceptions on the year to Kansas's 6, which that's problematic for a passing team like Texas is becoming. I think the biggest factor in this game, though, is, just like last week, the status of Kansas State quarterback Adrian Martinez. The most recent research that I was able to do at the time I filmed this, updated about 2 hours ago, was that he is a game-time decision, and backup quarterback Will Howard is ready to go if he needs to go in this game. If I was Kansas State, I would just start Will Howard. Why? Because the weakness of Texas's defense is their pass defense. They're letting up 249 yards a game, and you're passing the ball as Kansas State for only 185 yards a game. But Will Howard went off in that game last week against Okie State. Absolutely shredded them. Had well over 200 passing yards. Had, I think, like 3 or 4 passing touchdowns in that game. He just tore them to shreds. In Texas's game against Oklahoma State, that they let them come back in, Spencer Sanders and Okie State's passing game tore through Texas and their secondary in the second half of that game. I think if you're Kansas State and you want the best shot to win this game, I think you should start Will Howard and let your passing attack unleash itself on Texas's weaker pass defense. If Adrian Martinez is in, he is not as much of a passing quarterback. He's much more of a running quarterback, which plays into the strength of Texas's defense. Also, Texas had a bye week last week, so they've had an extra week to get ready. They've had an extra week to heal up any injuries. They've had an extra week to game plan for either Will Howard or Adrian Martinez. I think the uncertainty around the starting quarterback for Kansas State, I think the extra week that Texas has had to prepare, and I think the dramatic and unexpected margin of victory for Kansas State last week is going to lead them to have a letdown this week. I'm going to go with Texas to score the upset, despite the fact that I think Texas should not even be ranked this week because they have fewer wins and more losses than anyone else who's ranked in the top 25. And they have no notable wins this season. They're going to get their first notable win this week on the road against Kansas State. Number 14, the Utah Utes. They're 6-2 on the year. They're home versus Arizona. Arizona is not a very good football team. They're not even a good football team. Utah is a pretty good football team, and it's at home. So go with Utah in that particular matchup. Number 15, the Penn State Nittany Lions, coming off a home loss against Ohio State. They are on the road this week against Indiana. Indiana is not a very good team. They started out not bad, but they've kind of fallen off the last few weeks. Penn State, I think, is upset about that win. They know they're not going to win the Big Ten East. They know they're not going to the Big Ten championship game, but they have other goals in front of them, like maybe securing a good top-flight bowl game that they could still qualify for if they kept winning games. I think they're a bit angry about that loss against Ohio State. Look for Penn State to rebound this week against Indiana. Go with the Nittany Lions in that matchup. Another matchup in the Big Ten involves number 16 Illinois at 7-1 versus my Michigan State Spartans, who are coming off a I don't want to say necessarily a beatdown because they lost by a wide margin against Michigan, but not as wide of a margin as I thought they would lose by, and Michigan let them hang in that game longer than they probably should have let them hang in that game. Additionally, after the game against Michigan, a shameful and embarrassing situation happened in the tunnel where video was released from the Detroit News or the Detroit Free Press, one of the two, showing a group of 4 or 5 Michigan State players basically assaulting a Michigan player by themselves in the tunnel. It was quite literally a 4 or 5 on 1, and you saw Michigan State players knocking that Michigan player to the ground and kicking him repeatedly while he was on the ground. 4 Michigan State players have been suspended in the wake of that. Both schools' police departments are investigating the situation. Both schools' athletic directors are cooperating in this investigation. This is a black mark on a team that is already having a bad season and does not need any more black marks. This is a black mark on Mel Tucker's reputation of being a disciplined head coach. This is a shameful moment for Michigan State when they just don't need any more shameful moments. They have enough of those on the field. They don't need to be producing any more shameful moments off the field. I do not believe that that incident is going to be something that the coaching staff is going to use to rally the troops and try to use it as inspiration to see Michigan State win a few games in a row here at the end of the season. I think it might be a contributing factor into Michigan State spiraling out of control the rest of the season. Illinois, meanwhile, is a pretty good team. I still haven't really seen them play much, but they keep winning. They keep beating teams. I know Michigan State's not good. I know their secondary and their defense is not good. So look for Illinois to continue their winning ways and go to 8-1 and pretty much lock in their shot at a Big Ten championship later this season. Number 17, North Carolina. They're 7-1 on the year. They're on the road at Virginia. Virginia is not a very good football team. North Carolina is a very good football team that can put up points. Go with North Carolina to move to 8-1 on the year in that game. Number 18, Oklahoma State. They're 6-2 on the year. They're on the road at Kansas. They're coming off that embarrassing beatdown they suffered in Manhattan versus Kansas State last week. Kansas has fallen off the map a bit. They've lost a few games in a row since that 5-0 start. I think Oklahoma State goes into this game really angry about how they were treated by Kansas State last week. And I think when they're in Kansas, I don't think they're actually going to be seeing the Kansas Jayhawks across the line of scrimmage from them. I think they're going to be seeing the Kansas State Wildcats across the line of scrimmage from them, and they're going to take it out on Kansas. I think they're going to view this as like a revenge game for what happened last week. I think they are going to beat down Kansas in this one. Look for Oklahoma State to rebound in this matchup. Number 19, Tulane, the first place team in the American Athletic Conference. They're 7-1 on the year. They're on the road against Tulsa. I watched a bit of that game they played last week against Memphis. They were up 35-0 in the first half, but then they only scored 3 points in the second half, and they let Memphis score 28 points on them. And at the end of the game, Memphis was in their red zone going for another touchdown. Not a great performance in the second half on Tulane's defense. They obviously just sleptwalked their way through that game. I believe, even though I don't really know anything about Tulane and their head coaching staff, I would think that that would be a wake-up call for the coaches and the players that, okay, listen, we can't do that again. We need to put away teams and finish the job of putting them away, not let them creep back up. They've got a big matchup next week against the number 2 team in the conference, the UCF Knights, at home, at Tulane. I think they'll refocus. I don't know anything about Tulsa. I do know that Tulane's pretty good this year, so I'm willing to roll with the Green Wave once again. Let's go with Tulane to move to 8-1 and set up a pretty big matchup for next week. Number 20, the Syracuse Orange. They are on the road this week against Pitt. They are coming off a loss last week at home against an improving Notre Dame team. And that follows up a loss the previous week where they had a lead against Clemson of 11 points going into the fourth quarter, but they gave up 17 in that fourth quarter and lost that game. Pitt isn't a bad team. They're a nice team. They're not good, but they're not bad either. They're a nice team. They started out ranked. They played Tennessee tough earlier, but they've kind of fallen off a little bit. I think Syracuse is not going to have a second straight letdown game. I think last week was Syracuse's letdown game. They lost in that heartbreaking fashion with the come-from-behind loss, or come-from-behind victory that Clemson executed on them. And then they had the hangover last week when they welcomed in Notre Dame. I do not think they have a hangover for a second straight week. I think head coach Dino Babers gets his team back refocused, look for Syracuse to go to 7-2 on the year and win that game. Next, we have a matchup between the number 21 and number 22 teams in the ACC, with number 21 Wake Forest on the road at number 22 North Carolina State. North Carolina State is still without their starting quarterback Devin Leary, who again is out for the season. Their offense is not as good without Devin Leary in. They had to go to a third-string quarterback who seems like he's got the juice, who seems like he's got the energy when he came in and helped them win a game last week. I don't think, though, that offense with I think he's like a freshman starting quarterback now, who is inexperienced and who's not going to recognize some of the things that Wake Forest's defense is going to send at him. Also, I just don't view them with now a third-string quarterback keeping up offensively with Wake Forest and what starting quarterback Sam Hartman can do. I'm going to go with Wake Forest in that matchup to go to 7-2 on the year and dropping North Carolina State out of the top 25. Number 23, and in the top 25 for the first time this year, the Oregon State Beavers. They're 6-2 on the year. They're at Washington. I don't know anything about Oregon State. I saw a little bit of their game earlier this season against Fresno State, but it was like a 10:30 start, so I only watched like part of the first quarter. I've seen Washington play, and Washington isn't a slouch. They're also 6-2 on the year. And Michael Penix Jr. and that offense, they're still throwing the ball all over the yard to the tune of 379 yards a game. Meanwhile, Oregon State has thrown 11 interceptions on the year this season. That's concerning to me. Because I haven't seen Oregon State play, because I have seen Washington play a couple of times, and I know that they're a good team. I know that they're still offensively very prolific. And because of all those interceptions that Oregon State throws, I'm going to call the upset on this one. I'm going to go with a team that I know a little bit of in Washington to upset Oregon State. The game's at Washington, so I'm going to go with the Huskies to take down a Pac-12 North opponent and knock Oregon State out of the top 25 the week after they get into the top 25. Number 24, Texas. I've already said I think they're going to win on the road at Kansas. And finally, number 25, Central Florida. They are on the road at Memphis. This is an interesting matchup because in the game against Cincinnati, starting quarterback John Reese Plumlee went out with a head injury. And so his status is day-to-day, and he's going to be a game-time decision in this matchup. His backup, Mikey Keene, came in and did not perform poorly. He was 15 of 21 for 175 yards. But UCF did rely much more on their running game after the Plumlee injury, racking up 260 yards on the ground against Cincinnati. Memphis, meanwhile, is pretty decent at stopping the run, letting up 126 yards a game. They're not great at stopping the pass, though, letting up 283 yards a game. So if Plumlee can play for Central Florida, that gives them a decided edge because that passing attack, which can absolutely run the numbers up on people, will be either on point or close to it depending on how well Plumlee's feeling. If he's not in the game, their offense, my guess would probably rely more on their running game, which would mean this would be a much tighter game, probably one where there's not going to be as many points scored. Memphis has lost 3 straight games, letting up an average of 42 points a game. But it's at Memphis where they're 3-1. So this game's a little bit hard to call, and I don't call this game with a high degree of confidence. But I think UCF's going to get the job done on this one. UCF is sitting right now at second in the American Athletic Conference at 3-1, behind Tulane at 4-0. They're ahead of Cincinnati, who's at 3-1 as well, because Central Florida beat Cincinnati last week. And they're also ahead of 3-1 Houston. They need to keep winning, though, because they're playing a bunch of conference games here at the end. They are at Tulane next week, then they're home against Navy, then they're at Central Florida in their main rivalry game. They're looking forward to the game against Tulane down the road, and because the AAC doesn't do divisions, the top 2 teams will play in the AAC championship game. So Central Florida can't really drop any more games here. That East Carolina loss they had was a bad loss. They can't afford to drop another game because that's going to drop them out of contention for the conference championship. I do think they'll get a win. If Plumlee's in, I think it's a comfortable win. If he's not in, I think they get through the game and escape from Memphis with a victory. But go with TCF in that matchup. And that does it for the picks for Week 10 of the 2022 college football season. Leave me a comment below letting me know where you think I've gone right in my picks, where you think I've gone wrong in my picks. Also, let me know which game or games you're tuning into this weekend. I'm paying attention, as I think just about everybody is, to Tennessee, Georgia, and Alabama, LSU. Thanks so much for tuning in, everyone, and I'm looking forward to seeing you all in the next video.